There are stories the Federal Bureau of Investigation will never publish, files sealed not by bureaucracy, but by something darker, a recognition that some truths corrupt the very paper they're written on. In the summer of 1943, in a basement office in Lower Manhattan, 3 agents burned 17 pages of testimony. They didn't argue, they didn't discuss. They simply watched the papers curl into ash, and when the last ember died, the eldest among them, a man named Sullivan who'd survived Prohibition's bloodiest years, said only this: "Some women aren't meant to be remembered." The woman they were erasing was 24 years old. Her name was Isabella Marino. She had been married 8 months, widowed for 3, and by the time federal agents understood what she'd become, 6 men were dead, a political machine had collapsed, and an entire neighborhood in Brooklyn had learned to cross themselves when her name was spoken. Not in prayer, in protection. This is not a story about a gangster's wife. This is a story about the woman who made gangsters kneel. The building where those files burned still stands. The agents are long dead, but in the archives that remain, smuggled interview transcripts, parish records, a single photograph never catalogued, you can still trace the outline of what Isabella Marino did. Not the legend, not the myth whispered in Italian social clubs or Greenwich Village bars. The truth. The kind of truth that makes you understand why 3 federal agents chose silence over history. Before we continue the story of Isabella Marino, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city, which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. She was born Isabella Torrente in Red Hook, Brooklyn, in the spring of 1919, 2 months after her father returned from the Great War with lungs full of mustard gas and a Purple Heart he never wore. The family lived above a fish market on Van Brunt Street, where the air always smelled of salt and rot, where the cobblestones stayed slick with brine even in August heat. Her mother, Lucia, took in sewing. Her father, Carmine, worked the docks when his coughing allowed it, and drank when it didn't. They had 4 children. Isabella was the youngest and the only one who survived past age 7. Diphtheria took the boys in the winter of 1923. Influenza claimed her sister the following spring. By the time Isabella turned 6, she was an only child sleeping in a room that had once held 4 beds, learning to move through the apartment without making sound, understanding that grief had a smell, something between candle wax and vinegar, the scent of a home where death had visited too often. She was not a beautiful child, not in the way the neighborhood measured beauty. No ringlets, no round cheeks, no dimpled smile. Her face was angular even then, all sharp lines and serious eyes, the kind of face that made adults uncomfortable because it seemed to see too much. Father Castellano at St. Mary's Star of the Sea used to watch her during Mass, the way she sat perfectly still in the pew beside her mother, hands folded, lips moving through prayers she'd memorized before she could read. He told Lucia once that Isabella had the look of a little saint. Lucia, who knew her daughter better, said nothing. The girl was brilliant. That much was obvious before she turned 8. She learned English faster than her parents, reading it better than speaking it, devouring newspapers her father brought home from the docks. She'd sit by the window while her mother sewed, reading stories about City Hall corruption, about bootleggers and speakeasies, about the murder of Arnold Rothstein and the rise of men whose names she'd later come to know intimately, Luciano, Costello, Anastasia. She understood power before she understood arithmetic. By 10, she was keeping her father's books, such as they were. The small money he made loading cargo, the smaller money he lost to cards and cheap whiskey. She'd sit at the kitchen table with a pencil and a ledger stolen from the fish market below, writing numbers in columns that never balanced, understanding even then that her family was drowning in inches, that poverty wasn't dramatic or sudden, but a slow suffocation. Month after month of being just short, just behind, just not enough. She watched her mother's hands bleed from needlework. She watched her father cough blood into handkerchiefs he hid in his coat. And she understood, with the cold clarity that would define her entire life, that suffering was not noble. It was simply stupid. The depression came and made everything worse, though worse was relative when you'd never had much to lose. The fish market closed. Her father stopped getting dock work. Her mother took in more sewing, her fingers moving faster, bleeding more, the lamplight burning later into each night. Isabella was 12 when she started lying about her age to work at a garment factory on Atlantic Avenue, standing at a pressing machine 10 hours a day, breathing steam and chemical starch, watching women twice her age ruin their bodies for 60 cents a day. She lasted 3 months before she walked out mid-shift and never returned. What she did instead, no one in her family ever knew. But the money kept coming. Enough to pay rent. Enough to buy medicine for her father's cough. Enough to let her mother rest her hands for a day or two each week. When Lucia asked where the money came from, Isabella said she was tutoring the Benedetto children in English. When Father Castellano asked if she was staying out of trouble, she smiled and said she never missed confession. Both statements were lies. The truth was simpler and more prophetic. At 13 years old, Isabella Torrente had begun working for the Marino family, and she discovered she was very, very good at keeping secrets. The Marino family controlled Red Hook the way the church controlled heaven, with absolute authority and the promise of protection for those who obeyed. They ran the waterfront, the union halls, the betting parlors tucked behind barbershops and social clubs. They decided which ships unloaded, which trucks moved through the neighborhood, which businesses paid protection and which simply burned down. They were not the biggest operation in Brooklyn. That honor belonged to the Profaci family in Carroll Gardens, but they were efficient, disciplined, and ruthlessly loyal to their own. At the head of this machine was Salvatore Marino, 46 years old, twice widowed, father of 3 sons and ruler of 12 square blocks he considered more sacred than anything in Rome. He was not a loud man, not a flashy man. He wore dark suits that cost more than most men earned in a month, but they were conservative, almost clerical in their simplicity. He attended Mass every Sunday, sat in the same pew, never missed a holy day of obligation. He donated to the church, sponsored the parish festival, paid for the roof repair when winter storms damaged St. Mary's Star of the Sea. He also ordered the deaths of 11 men between 1930 and 1941, and those were just the ones anyone could prove. His sons were younger versions of their father, Dominic, 26, who handled the unions, Anthony, 24, who managed collections, and Paolo, 21, who everyone knew would inherit the operation when Salvatore finally stepped down. They dressed like their father, spoke like their father, carried themselves with the same quiet authority that made men step aside when they walked down Van Brunt Street. Isabella met Paolo Marino in February of 1933 in the back room of a social club on Union Street, where she'd been summoned to explain why she'd been seen talking to a police officer outside the fish market. She was 13, he was 16, and she was not afraid. The room smelled of cigar smoke and espresso. 4 men sat around a table playing cards, barely glancing at the girl who'd been brought in by Joey Lanza, one of Salvatore's street enforcers. Paolo sat in the corner, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, watching her with the bored curiosity of someone who'd seen 100 frightened children brought before the family and expected this to be no different. "You talked to a cop," Joey said, his voice flat. "Officer Murphy, outside Vittorio's market. You want to tell us why?" Isabella looked at him without blinking. "He asked me for directions to the subway. I told him. Then I came home." "You know who we are?" "Yes." "You know what happens to people who talk to cops?" I wasn't talking to him. I was answering a question. There's a difference. One of the card players laughed. Joey's face darkened. Paolo stopped cleaning his nails and looked up. Really looked at her for the first time. This skinny girl in a too large coat with eyes that didn't flinch and a voice that didn't shake. "How old are you?" Paolo asked. 14, she lied, adding a year without hesitation. "You live above the old fish market?" "Yes." "Your father's Carmine Torrente?" "Yes." Paolo studied her for a long moment, then folded his knife and stood up. He walked over to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could smell his cologne and the tobacco on his breath. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't a question. "Should I be?" He smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a cruel one either. Something in between. The smile of someone recognizing something unexpected and potentially useful. "Joey," he said, not looking away from Isabella. Let her go, she's just a kid. Then he turned back to his card game, and Isabella was dismissed. She walked home through streets dark with February cold, past the docks where her father had once worked, past the church where she still pretended to pray, and she understood something she'd already suspected. The Marino family wasn't just powerful, they were smart, and smart people could always use someone smarter. 3 days later, she returned to the social club on her own and asked to speak with Paolo Marino. She told him she could read and write in both English and Italian. She told him she was good with numbers. She told him she could move through the neighborhood without attracting attention because she was young, because she was a girl, because no one looked twice at the daughter of Carmine Torrente. She didn't tell him she was desperate. She didn't tell him she was tired of watching her mother bleed into fabric and her father drown in his own lungs. She didn't tell him she'd rather risk her life than waste it. Paolo hired her to run messages, small things at first, envelopes delivered to addresses she didn't ask questions about, packages picked up from apartments where the windows were always curtained. She was paid $5 a week, which was more than her mother made in a month, and she never missed a delivery, never opened an envelope, never spoke a word about what she'd seen or where she'd been. By the time she was 16, she was doing the family's bookkeeping. By the time she was 18, she knew more about the Marino operation than Salvatore's own sons. And by the time Paolo asked her to marry him, 3 weeks after her 23rd birthday, she'd been in love with him for exactly 9 years and 3 months. She said yes before he finished asking. They were married on September 12, 1942, in St. Mary Star of the Sea, the same church where Isabella had sat beside her mother as a child, memorizing prayers she didn't believe in, and learning to recognize power in the men who entered through the side door after Mass. The men Father Castellano always made time to speak with. The men whose donations kept the lights on and the roof patched. The wedding was large but not ostentatious. 200 guests. Flowers that were expensive but not extravagant. A reception at the social club with food catered by every Italian restaurant in Red Hook. The neighborhood came out because the neighborhood had no choice, but also because Paolo Marino was well liked, because he didn't flaunt his family's power, because he was fair in his dealings and generous to those who showed respect, and because everyone was curious about the girl he'd chosen. Isabella wore white, as tradition demanded, though she'd stopped believing in the symbolism years ago. The dress was simple, elegant, borrowed from the sister of one of Salvatore's business associates. Her hair was dark and pulled back, her face composed, her eyes bright with something that could have been joy or satisfaction or victory. It was hard to tell, and no one looked too closely. Her mother wept. Her father, skeletal now from the disease eating his lungs, walked her down the aisle with a pride that made his eyes shine and his hands shake. Father Castellano performed the ceremony, his voice solemn as he spoke about the sanctity of marriage, the bonds that could not be broken, the vows that were sworn before God. Paolo's hand was warm when he slipped the ring onto her finger. His kiss was gentle, and when she turned to face the congregation as Mrs. Paolo Marino, she saw the future spreading before her like a map she'd already memorized. No one knew it then. But the wedding was the last time anyone in Red Hook would see Isabella Torrente. The woman who emerged from that church was someone else entirely. The reception lasted until 2 in the morning. Wine flowed, music played, old men danced with young women and told stories about the old country, about Ellis Island, about the years when the neighborhood was being built and everyone was young and strong and full of dreams. Isabella danced with her husband, with his father, with each of his brothers. She smiled at the right moments, laughed at the right jokes, accepted congratulations with the grace of someone who'd been born into this world rather than fought her way into it. She was perfect. And perfection, as anyone in that room could have told you, is always dangerous. The Marinos had given the couple an apartment on Columbia Street, 3 blocks from the waterfront, with tall windows that looked out over the docks and floors that creaked in the specific way old Brooklyn buildings always creaked. It was furnished simply. Heavy, dark furniture, religious icons on the walls, a kitchen that smelled of the lemon oil Salvatore's housekeeper had used to polish the cabinets. Paolo carried her over the threshold because that's what tradition required, and Isabella let herself be carried because she understood the importance of performing the expected rituals. But once the door was closed, once they were alone for the first time as husband and wife, she stepped out of his arms and walked to the window, looking out at the street below, at the shadows pooling between streetlights, at the city that was hers now, in a way it had never been before. "Are you happy?" Paolo asked, coming up behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. She leaned back against him. "Yes." "Nervous?" "No." He laughed softly. "Most brides are nervous." "I'm not most brides." "No," he agreed, kissing the top of her head. "You're not." They made love that night with the window open, letting in the September air and the sound of the docks, the distant horn of a ship coming into harbor. Isabella had never been with a man before, not because of faith or propriety, but simply because she'd never had time for anything that didn't serve her purpose. She gave herself to her husband with the same calculation she brought to everything else, understanding what was expected, learning what pleased him, filing away information for future use. Paolo was gentle. Paolo was patient. Paolo believed his wife was a virgin in more than just body. Innocent, sheltered. A good Catholic girl who'd been faithful to the values her mother had taught her. Isabella let him believe it. She was pregnant within 3 weeks. The pregnancy changed everything, though not in the ways Paolo expected. He'd imagined his wife would slow down, would spend her days resting and preparing for motherhood, would gradually transition from the sharp-minded girl he'd married into the domestic angel his mother had been, the kind of woman who ruled her household with quiet authority but never questioned the decisions made by men. Isabella had other ideas. She was sick every morning for the first 3 months, but she was at the dining table by 8, going through the family's books, making notes in her precise handwriting, catching discrepancies that Paolo's brothers had missed or ignored. She attended Mass every Sunday, her rosary beads clicking between her fingers, her head bowed in what everyone assumed was prayer, but was actually deep concentration on the conversation she'd overheard between 2 union men before the service. She made herself indispensable. Salvatore noticed first. He'd come to the apartment on Columbia Street for dinner, something he did once a week, a tradition that allowed him to check on his youngest son and ensure the marriage was progressing as it should. He expected to find Isabella in the kitchen, fussing over pasta sauce and bread, playing the role of dutiful daughter-in-law. Instead, he found her at the dining table with ledgers spread across the surface, a pencil tucked behind her ear, her lips moving silently as she calculated figures. "You should be resting," he said, standing in the doorway. She looked up, and for a moment, Salvatore saw something in her expression that reminded him of himself 30 years ago, a hunger that had nothing to do with food or comfort or even power, a hunger to prove that every assumption about her was wrong. "I'm pregnant, not sick," she said. "And these numbers are wrong." "What numbers?" "The protection collections from the garment district. Someone's been skimming. Not much, $50, maybe $60 a month, but it's consistent. Same amount, same timing, same 3 locations." She turned the ledger toward him. "See?" Salvatore came closer, looking at the columns she'd marked. He saw it immediately, the pattern she'd identified, the slow bleed of money that would have gone unnoticed for years if someone hadn't been paying attention. "Who's collecting from those locations?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Jimmy Greco." Salvatore said nothing for a long moment. Jimmy Greco had been with the family for 8 years. He was trusted, he was reliable. He was also apparently a thief. "Show me," Salvatore said. Isabella showed him. For the next hour they sat at that table going through numbers, tracing patterns, building a case that was undeniable. Paolo came home to find his wife and his father bent over paperwork like business partners, speaking in the shorthand of people who understood exactly what the other was thinking. He should have been proud. Instead, he felt the first stirring of something that felt uncomfortably like unease. Jimmy Greco disappeared 2 weeks later. His body was never found, which was standard procedure for thieves who stole from the family. What wasn't standard was that Isabella was the one who'd identified him. What wasn't standard was that Salvatore had believed her without question. What wasn't standard was that a 23-year-old pregnant woman had just demonstrated she had better instincts than men who'd been in the business for decades. The other families noticed. The FBI noticed. and in a basement apartment on President Street, a man named Vincent Castellana, who worked as an enforcer for the Profaci family and had been waiting 5 years for an opportunity to move against the Marinos, began to think about a pregnant girl with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and to wonder what she might be capable of if given the right motivation. Isabella's daughter was born on June 3rd, 1943, in the bedroom of the apartment on Columbia Street, delivered by a midwife who'd brought half the children in Red Hook into the world and who knew better than to gossip about the families she served. The labor was long but not complicated. The baby was small but healthy. With her father's dark eyes and her mother's serious expression, they named her Lucia, after Isabella's mother, who died of pneumonia that winter. Her hands finally still, her burden of grief and exhaustion finally lifted. Paolo wept when he held his daughter. Isabella, pale and exhausted, watched her husband cry and felt nothing but a distant satisfaction that she'd given him what he wanted. She loved the baby, or she thought she did. It was hard to tell. Motherhood was supposed to transform you, supposed to unlock some deep well of emotion that made everything else pale in comparison. But when Isabella looked at Lucia, what she felt was responsibility, obligation, the understanding that this child was now another piece on the board, another element to consider in every decision she made. She nursed because that's what was expected. She recovered because her body was young and strong. And she returned to the family's books within 2 weeks because the war effort had made their operations more complex, and complexity was something Isabella understood better than anyone. The war had been good for business. Rationing meant black markets. Government contracts meant opportunities for kickbacks. The docks were busier than ever, and the Marino family controlled access to half the waterfront. Money flowed in faster than it had in a decade, and with that money came risk. New players, new attention, new federal interest in how goods were moving through Brooklyn. The FBI had a field office in downtown Manhattan. They'd been watching the Italian families for years, building files, cultivating informants, waiting for someone to make a mistake. The war had given them additional resources and additional justification. Enemy sabotage, black market operations, union corruption. The Bureau had a dozen open investigations in Brooklyn alone, and the Marino family was on every list. Special Agent Robert Brennan had been assigned to the case in April of 1943. He was 32, Harvard-educated, 3 years with the Bureau, ambitious in the quiet way that made superiors notice. He'd grown up in Boston, Catholic but lapsed, Irish but not particularly sentimental about it. He believed in law and order, with the conviction of someone who'd never had to choose between feeding his family and breaking the law. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man who should never have been assigned to investigate organized crime in Brooklyn. His partner was James Sullivan, older, wiser, a veteran of prohibition enforcement who'd seen enough blood to understand that the world was more complicated than the law allowed for. Sullivan had been trying to build a case against the Marino family for 6 years. He had files. He had informants. He had testimony from low-level operators who'd been caught and were willing to talk in exchange for lighter sentences. What he didn't have was proof that would hold up in court. What he didn't have was access to the family's real operations. What he didn't have was Isabella. They first became aware of her in July of 1943, when an informant mentioned that Paolo Marino's new wife was doing the family's bookkeeping. Sullivan filed the information without much interest. Wives and daughters kept books all the time. It didn't mean anything. But then another informant mentioned her. Then another. And slowly a picture began to emerge of a young woman who was more than decorative, more than domestic, more than anyone had expected. Brennan wanted to bring her in for questioning. Sullivan said no. Brennan wanted to put surveillance on the apartment. Sullivan said no. Brennan wanted to know why they weren't pursuing the most promising lead they'd had in years. Sullivan told him, "Because women like that don't talk, and if we push, we'll get nothing but silence and a lawsuit for harassment." He was right, but not in the way he thought. Isabella knew about the FBI interest before they officially approached her. She knew because she paid attention, because she listened to conversations Paolo thought she wasn't hearing, because she'd cultivated relationships with the wives of other family men. Women who were underestimated just like she was, Women who knew everything their husbands thought they were hiding. She knew the Bureau was building a case. She knew they had informants. And she knew, with the cold certainty that had defined every major decision of her life, that the Marino family was vulnerable in ways that Paolo and his brothers didn't understand. So she made a choice. On August 14, 1943, Isabella Marino walked into the FBI field office in Lower Manhattan and asked to speak with whoever was investigating organized crime in Brooklyn. They brought her to a small room with concrete walls and a single window that looked out at the street. Agent Brennan came in first, surprised and immediately suspicious. Agent Sullivan came in behind him, and when he saw her, this small woman in a dark blue dress, a baby in her arms, rosary beads wrapped around her wrist, he knew immediately that something was very wrong. "Mrs. Marino," Brennan said, taking a seat across from her, "this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is." Her voice was calm, composed, the voice of someone who'd thought through every word before speaking. "What can we do for you?" "I have information about the Marino family's operations. I'm willing to provide it in exchange for protection for myself and my daughter." Brennan glanced at Sullivan. Sullivan's face was unreadable. "What kind of information?" Brennan asked. "Everything. The waterfront operations, the union arrangements, the protection collections, the black market distribution, names, dates, amounts. Everything you'd need to bring charges." "Why?" It was the right question. Isabella looked at Agent Brennan with eyes that were neither pleading nor defiant, simply direct. "Because my husband is going to be killed," she said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. There's a war coming between families and the Marinos are going to lose. I can see it. They can't, or they won't. And when it happens, my daughter will have no father and no protection. So I'm buying our future the only way I know how. By betraying your family. By surviving." Sullivan spoke for the first time. "What makes you think we can protect you?" Isabella smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I don't think you can. But I think you'll try. And trying is better than nothing." They talked for 3 hours. Isabella laid out the Marino family's structure with the precision of an engineer describing a machine. She provided names, addresses, patterns of operation. She explained how the docks worked, how the unions were controlled, how money moved through the neighborhood in ways that left no paper trail except the one she'd carefully maintained in ledgers Paolo thought were kept at home, but which Isabella had been secretly copying and storing in locations the family would never think to look. Brennan was elated, Sullivan was terrified, because both men understood what Isabella was offering wasn't cooperation. It was war. The war Isabella predicted arrived ahead of schedule, and it came from a direction no one expected. On September 2nd, 1943, Paolo Marino was shot twice in the chest outside a coffee shop on Court Street. He died before the ambulance arrived, his blood pooling on the sidewalk where school children would have to step over it the next morning on their way to class. The shooter was never identified. The official investigation went nowhere. But everyone in Brooklyn knew who was responsible, even if they couldn't prove it. The Profaci family, making a move to consolidate control over the waterfront, eliminating the youngest and most capable of Salvatore's sons in a statement that was as clear as it was brutal. Isabella received the news at home. She was nursing Lucia when Dominic arrived, his face gray, his hands shaking. He told her in a voice that barely worked that Paolo was gone. He told her she needed to come to Salvatore's house. He told her the family would take care of her, would make sure she and the baby were protected. Isabella said nothing. She simply finished nursing her daughter, changed into a black dress, and followed Dominic out to the car that was waiting in the street. The Marino household was in chaos. Paolo's brothers were screaming for revenge. Salvatore sat in his study, silent and old, his hands folded on his desk, his eyes fixed on nothing. The wives cried, the children whispered, and Isabella moved through it all like a ghost, her face expressionless, her daughter in her arms. Her mind working through calculations no one else in that house was capable of making. She stayed 3 days. She attended the funeral, standing beside Salvatore while Father Castellano said Mass for the dead, while the neighborhood filled the church to capacity, while everyone whispered about Paolo's widow. So young, so tragic, so perfectly stoic in her grief. She said all the right things. She accepted all the right condolences. And on the third night, when the house was finally quiet, she walked into Salvatore's study and told him exactly what was going to happen next. "The prophecies will come for you," she said. "Not today, not next week, but soon. They've eliminated Paolo because he was your successor. They'll eliminate your other sons because they're your strength. And then they'll negotiate your retirement, which will actually be your execution, and they'll take control of everything you've built." Salvatore looked at her with the exhausted eyes of a man who'd just buried his youngest son. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I can stop it." "How?" "By giving them what they want before they have to take it." She laid out her plan with the same clarity she'd used when explaining the Jimmy Greco situation, when explaining the FBI's investigation, when explaining every complex problem she'd ever been given. It was elegant. It was ruthless. And it required Salvatore to do something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He had to make Isabella his partner, not his daughter-in-law, not his bookkeeper, not the widow of his son, his partner, equal authority, equal access, equal respect. In exchange, she would handle the negotiation with the Profacis. She would arrange a treaty that would preserve Salvatore's life, protect his remaining sons, and maintain the Marino family's control over their core territories. She would do this because she understood something Paolo's brothers didn't, that the war everyone expected was already lost. The only question was how much they'd lose. Isabella's proposal gave them a chance to lose with dignity. Salvatore was silent for a long time. Then he asked the question Isabella had been waiting for. "What do you get out of this?" "Control," she said simply. "Complete control over the Marino family's financial operations. I'll manage the books, the collections, the investments. I'll handle the money side of everything. Your sons can handle enforcement, logistics, street operations, but the money flows through me. Why? Because money is power, and power is how I keep my daughter safe." Salvatore understood. He was old. He was grieving. He was smart enough to recognize when someone smarter was offering him a lifeline. "All right," he said, "but if you betray this family—" "I won't," Isabella interrupted, "because this family is how I survive. I don't need you to trust me. I need you to understand that my interests and yours are aligned. Everything I do protects what you've built. Everything I do keeps your sons alive. Everything I do makes us stronger." "And the FBI?" Isabella's expression didn't change. "What about them?" "You went to them." She'd wondered if he knew. Now she had her answer. "Yes," she said. "I offered them information in exchange for protection. I did it because I knew Paolo was going to die and I needed insurance, but I didn't give them anything they can use. Nothing that would hold up in court. Nothing that would damage the family. I gave them enough to keep them interested, not enough to hurt us. That's a dangerous game. Everything is dangerous. The question is whether you're smart enough to play." Salvatore looked at her for a long moment, this girl who'd come from nothing, who'd married his son, who was now proposing to become one of the most powerful people in the organization. "Paolo used to say you were brilliant," he said quietly. "I thought he was just in love. I was wrong." "Yes," Isabella said, "you were." The treaty with the Profaci family was negotiated in a restaurant in Carroll Gardens, over wine and pasta, and conversations that never mentioned the murder everyone knew they were discussing. Isabella represented the Marinos. Vincent Castellana represented the Profacis. And for 3 hours, they carved up Brooklyn like two surgeons discussing an operation. Isabella gave ground in places that didn't matter. She held firm on everything essential. She structured the agreement so that the Marino family maintained their core territories, the docks, the union halls, the social clubs that generated the majority of their income, while ceding peripheral operations that had been more trouble than they were worth. She did all of this while Castellana watched her with the expression of a man who couldn't decide if he was impressed or insulted that the Marinos had sent a woman to negotiate. "You're very confident," he said at one point, after Isabella had rejected his third attempt to expand Profaci control into the Longshoremen's Union. I'm very prepared, she corrected. There's a difference. My husband is dead. I'm here representing my father-in-law, who has authorized me to finalize this agreement. If you have concerns about my authority, we can end this conversation now, and you can deal with Dominic and Anthony instead. But I'll warn you, they're less interested in compromise than I am. Castellana smiled. I believe that. The agreement was reached by midnight. Handshakes were exchanged. Wine was drunk. And Isabella went home to the apartment on Columbia Street, where her daughter slept in a crib and her husband's clothes still hung in the closet, and she sat by the window looking out at the docks and understood that she'd just done something no woman in the history of Brooklyn's organized crime families had ever done. She'd negotiated a peace. And peace, she knew, was just another word for opportunity. The FBI was watching. Of course they were watching. Brennan and Sullivan had agents at both ends of the block, photographing everyone who entered the restaurant, noting arrival and departure times, trying to build a case from the outside because they didn't have anyone on the inside. They saw Isabella arrive. They saw her leave. They added her photograph to their files. And Brennan, young and ambitious and fundamentally misunderstanding what he was witnessing, said to his partner, "We should bring her in again. She's clearly involved in operations now. We could pressure her." Sullivan, who'd been doing this work for 15 years and who understood power in ways Brennan never would, shook his head. "She's not involved in operations," he said quietly, watching Isabella's figure disappear down the street. "She is the operation." He was right, but he didn't know how right, because what Isabella had really done in that restaurant wasn't negotiate peace. She'd bought time. Time to consolidate power within the Marino family. Time to identify which men were loyal and which were liabilities. Time to restructure the financial operations so thoroughly that by the time anyone realized what she'd done, it would be too late to stop her. She was 24 years old. She'd been a widow for 3 weeks, and she'd just become the most dangerous person in Brooklyn. The restructuring happened slowly, like winter arriving, so gradual you didn't notice until everything was frozen. Isabella started with the books. She implemented new systems for tracking collections, for recording protection payments, for monitoring the docks. She created redundancies, cross-checks, verification processes that made it nearly impossible to skim money without her knowledge. The men grumbled at first. Who was this girl to tell them how to do jobs they'd been doing for years? But they complied because Salvatore wanted them to comply, and more importantly, because Isabella caught 3 more thieves in the first 2 months, saving the family tens of thousands of dollars. Then she started attending meetings, not as a secretary or a silent observer, but as a participant. She'd sit at the table beside Salvatore, her ledgers in front of her, her daughter sometimes sleeping in a basket at her feet, and she'd listen to the men discuss enforcement and collections and territorial disputes. And when they were done, she'd speak, usually just for a minute or two, usually about some financial implication they hadn't considered, some risk they hadn't accounted for, and they'd listen, because what Isabella said always made sense. By January of 1944, she was running the family's investments. The war economy had created opportunities in defense contracting, in transportation, in warehousing. The Marino family had always kept their money in cash or simple real estate. Isabella moved it into stocks, bonds, business partnerships that looked legitimate on paper and generated returns that doubled what they'd been making from traditional operations. She made them richer, she made them smarter, and she made them dependent on her in ways they didn't fully understand until it was far too late. Dominic noticed first. He came to the apartment on Columbia Street one evening in February, ostensibly to check on his sister-in-law and niece, actually to confront Isabella about the fact that he no longer understood how the family's money worked. "Everything goes through you now," he said, standing in her small living room, his voice tight with frustration. "Every decision, every payment, every investment. It's not right, Isabella, you're Paolo's widow. You should be home raising Lucia, not running the family like you're one of us." Isabella, who was nursing her daughter, looked up at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. "I am one of you," she said. "Your father made that decision when he asked for my help. If you have a problem with it, take it up with him." but I'd suggest you don't. Because the day you convince him to remove me from operations is the day the FBI gets every piece of evidence they need to destroy this family." Dominic went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about insurance. I'm talking about the fact that I've been copying every ledger, every record, every piece of information about this family's operations since the day I started working for you. And I've been storing those copies in a safe location with instructions that if anything happens to me, they go straight to the federal building in Manhattan." "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Isabella shifted Lucia to her other breast, her movements calm, unhurried. "Your father knows about this arrangement. He agreed to it, because he understands that my survival is tied to the family's survival. If I'm arrested, you're all arrested. If I'm killed, you're all investigated. The only way the Marino family stays safe is if I stay safe. Which means my position here isn't just useful, it's essential. That's extortion. That's pragmatism. And if you were smart, you'd be grateful for it. Because the FBI has been trying to build a case against this family for 6 years. And the only reason they haven't succeeded is because I've been very careful about what I give them and what I keep hidden." Dominic stared at her, his fists clenched, his face red. Paolo would have done exactly what I'm doing if he'd been smart enough to think of it," Isabella interrupted, her voice still calm, still patient, but with an edge now that made Dominic take a step back. "But he wasn't. He was brave, and he was loyal, and he was good, and that's why he's dead. I'm none of those things. I'm just very, very good at survival. And survival means making sure that the people who could destroy me need me too much to risk it." She stood, cradling Lucia against her shoulder, and walked to the window. The street below was dark except for a single streetlight, its glow pooling on the wet pavement. "You can hate me if you want," she said, not looking at him. "You can resent me. You can complain to your father. You can tell anyone who'll listen that I'm dangerous and overstepping. But you can't remove me, because the moment you try, the moment any of you try, everything falls apart. The FBI closes in. The Profasis smell weakness, and the family that Salvatore spent 30 years building crumbles in a month." "Why are you doing this?" Dominic asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "What do you want?" Isabella turned to look at him, her daughter asleep now, her own face unreadable in the dim light. "I want my daughter to grow up safe," she said. "I want her to have opportunities I never had. I want her to live in a world where she doesn't have to choose between starvation and sin. And the only way I can give her that is by making sure I have enough power that no one can take it away from me. Not the FBI, not other families, not even you." Dominic left without another word. He went straight to his father and repeated the conversation. And Salvatore, who'd already known what Isabella had done, who'd already agreed to it, simply nodded and told his son to let it go. Because Salvatore understood what his sons didn't. Isabella wasn't a threat to the family. She was the family. The FBI increased their surveillance in March of 1944. They had enough evidence now to know that Isabella was central to the Marino operations, but not enough to prove criminal activity in a way that would survive a courtroom. So they watched, they photographed, they documented her movements, her meetings, the men who came to her apartment and left carrying envelopes. Agent Brennan was convinced they were building a case. Agent Sullivan was convinced they were watching someone who would never make a mistake. He was almost right. On April 18th, Isabella was approached by a man named Michael DeLucci, a low-level associate who'd been working with the family for 2 years, running protection collections from a string of restaurants in Bensonhurst. He came to her apartment in the afternoon when he knew she'd be alone with Lucia, and he told her he needed to talk. She made him coffee. She listened while he explained that he was being pressured by federal agents, that they'd arrested him on a minor charge and were offering to drop it in exchange for information about the Marino family. "What did you tell them?" Isabella asked, her voice calm. "Nothing," Michael said quickly. "I told them nothing. I came straight to you." "Why?" "Because I don't know what to do. They want me to wear a wire. They want me to record conversations with Dominic and Anthony. They said if I don't cooperate, they'll charge me with racketeering and I'll go away for 10 years. Isabella sipped her coffee, thinking. Michael DeLucci was expendable. He knew nothing significant. He had no access to real operations, but he was also a test. If he'd come to her before going to the FBI, that meant either he was genuinely loyal or he was setting a trap. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Tell me what to say. Tell me how to handle them. You want to know what I think?" "Yes." Isabella set down her coffee cup. She looked at Michael with the same direct gaze she'd given Agent Brennan, the same gaze she'd given Vincent Castellana, the same gaze that told everyone who saw it that she was never, ever bluffing. "I think you're already working with them," she said. "I think you went to the FBI first, not me. I think they sent you here to see how I'd react, what I'd tell you to do, whether I'd incriminate myself. And I think you're wearing a wire right now." Michael's face went white. "Isabella, I swear..." "Show me." "What?" "Show me you're not wearing a wire. Take off your shirt." Michael stood frozen. His hands shook. And Isabella knew she was right. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. According to the FBI report that was later burned, Michael DeLucci left Isabella Marino's apartment unharmed and immediately reported the encounter to his handlers. According to neighborhood gossip, Michael was never seen again. According to Salvatore's testimony years later, during a closed-door session with federal prosecutors, Isabella called her brother-in-law Anthony, explained the situation, and let him handle it. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Michael DeLucci did leave the apartment alive. He did make it to the street, but he never made it to his handlers. His body was found 3 days later in a warehouse in Red Hook, beaten to death, his recording device smashed beside him. The FBI investigated. No arrests were ever made, and Agent Sullivan added 17 pages of detailed notes to his file about Isabella Marino, notes that documented her involvement, her methods, her intelligence, and most importantly, her absolute ruthlessness in protecting the family. Those were the pages that would later be burned, because by the time Sullivan wrote them, by the time he fully understood what Isabella was capable of, it was clear that arresting her would require evidence they could never gather, testimony they could never secure, and a willingness to face retaliation that the Bureau wasn't prepared to risk. Isabella Marino wasn't just untouchable, she was invisible. Everything she did was filtered through men. Every order she gave was carried out by someone else. Every decision she made could be attributed to Salvatore or his sons. She left no fingerprints, no recordings, no witnesses who would testify. She was a ghost with a ledger. And ghosts, Agent Sullivan knew, were very hard to arrest. By the fall of 1944, the Marino family's operations had been completely transformed. They were making more money than ever, investing in legitimate businesses, expanding into new territories through partnerships rather than violence. The peace treaty with the Prophecies held, largely because Isabella maintained constant communication with their financial operations, creating a web of mutual interests that made conflict unprofitable. She was invited to meetings with other families, not officially, never officially, but as Salvatore's representative, his advisor, the woman who understood the numbers better than anyone. The old men didn't like it. The old men grumbled about tradition and respect and the proper place of women, but they couldn't argue with results. And they were terrified of what she knew. Because Isabella had done something brilliant and terrible, she'd made herself essential to not just the Marino family, but to the entire network of operations in Brooklyn. She handled the books for 3 families. She managed investments for 5. She knew where every dollar came from and where every body was buried, sometimes literally. If she talked, everyone went down, so no one touched her, no one threatened her, no one even raised their voice around her. She was 24 years old, and she'd achieved something no man in the history of organized crime had managed: complete immunity through mutual destruction. Her daughter, Lucia, grew. Beautiful and quiet, she spent her days with nannies while her mother worked, learning Italian and English, attending a private Catholic school paid for with money from sources she'd never know. Isabella was a good mother in the technical sense. Lucia was fed, clothed, educated, kept safe. But there was a distance there, a coldness that Lucia would grow up feeling without understanding. Years later, in therapy she'd attend after Isabella's death, Lucia would tell her doctor, "My mother loved me the way some people love their jewelry. I was valuable, I was protected, but I was never actually held." Isabella's own mother had held her, had bled for her, had died poor and exhausted and forgotten. Isabella had no intention of following that path. On December 20th, 1944, the FBI made their move. Agents Brennan and Sullivan, backed by 10 others, arrived at the apartment on Columbia Street with a warrant for Isabella's arrest on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and being an accessory to murder. They'd spent 10 months building the case. They had testimony from informants. They had surveillance photos. They had financial records. They thought they had everything. Isabella opened the door in a grey dress, her hair pulled back, Lucia on her hip. She looked at the warrant, looked at the agents crowding the hallway and smiled. "You should come in," she said. "This won't take long." They brought her to the same room where she'd first approached them 15 months ago. Brennan was confident, Sullivan was uneasy, and Isabella sat across from them with her lawyer, a man named Jonathan Reeves, one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in New York, and calmly dismantled their case. Every informant recanted, every document was explained, every photograph was justified. She was a widow managing her late husband's legitimate business interests. She was a mother providing for her daughter. She was a bookkeeper, helping her father-in-law manage his investments. Nothing illegal, nothing prosecutable, nothing that would survive 5 minutes in front of a jury. After 4 hours, they had to let her go. Brennan was furious. Sullivan was resigned. And as they watched Isabella walk out of the building, her lawyer beside her, her head high, Sullivan made a decision. He couldn't arrest her. He couldn't prosecute her. But he could document her. Every detail, every connection, every piece of evidence he'd gathered. He'd write it all down, create a record that would exist even if it never became public, so that someday someone would understand what Isabella Marino had been. It took him 3 months to compile the report. 17 pages of single-spaced typing, documenting Isabella's rise from poverty to power, her methods, her intelligence, her absolute moral flexibility. He included everything. Michael DeLucci's death, the treaty negotiation, the financial restructuring, the way she'd made herself indispensable to multiple crime families. He showed it to his supervisor. The supervisor read it, went pale, and said, "We can't include this in the official record." Why not? Because if it becomes public, every family in the city will want her dead. And if she dies, every piece of evidence she's holding disappears, and we lose any chance of ever prosecuting these operations. She's not just untouchable, she's structurally necessary. As long as she's alive and managing the books, we have at least some visibility into what these families are doing. If she's gone, it all goes underground in ways we'll never crack. So we do nothing. We document it, we keep it classified, and we hope she makes a mistake. But Isabella never made mistakes. She lived another 16 years. She watched her daughter grow up. She attended Mass every Sunday, her rosary beads clicking, her face composed in what everyone assumed was devotion. She managed the Marino family through Salvatore's death in 1951, through the transitions of power that followed, through the investigations and crackdowns that came and went. She was never arrested again. She was never publicly associated with criminal activity. She died in 1959, in the same apartment on Columbia Street where she'd lived with Paolo, where she'd raised Lucia, where she'd built an empire from numbers and silence. The official cause of death was heart failure. She was 40 years old. The unofficial story, whispered in Brooklyn for years afterward, was that Isabella Marino hadn't died of heart failure at all. She'd simply decided it was time to disappear. That somewhere in America, under another name, a middle-aged woman with dark eyes and a serious expression was living a life no one would ever connect to the girl from Red Hook, who'd once made the FBI burn its own files rather than admit what she'd done. But that's probably just a story. Probably. In the summer of 1960, Agent Sullivan retired from the FBI. On his last day, he went down to the basement where old case files were stored and found the box containing the Isabella Marino investigation. He took out the 17 pages he'd written, the pages that had been classified and sealed and forgotten. He brought them to a conference room where 2 younger agents, men who'd replaced Brennan after he'd transferred to another office, were waiting. He told them the story, all of it. The brilliant girl from Red Hook, who'd married into a crime family and ended up running operations that spanned 3 boroughs. The woman who'd made herself so essential that prosecuting her would have destroyed the Bureau's ability to monitor organized crime in Brooklyn. The 24-year-old who'd negotiated peace treaties, ordered murders, and created financial systems so complex that even the families she worked for didn't fully understand them. When he finished, one of the young agents asked, "Why are you telling us this?" Sullivan looked at the pages spread across the table. Evidence of crimes that could never be prosecuted, testimony that would never be heard, a record of evil so sophisticated that even documenting it felt dangerous. "Because someone should know," he said. "Someone should understand what we were up against, what we let walk away." Then he gathered the pages, walked to the incinerator in the basement and burned them, all 17 pages. The 3 men stood there in silence, watching the paper curl and blacken and disappear. "Some women," Sullivan said finally, "aren't meant to be remembered." But he was wrong about that. Isabella Marino is remembered, not in FBI files, not in official histories, but in the neighborhoods she controlled, in the families she manipulated, in the structures she built that lasted decades after her death. She's remembered in the stories old men tell in social clubs, in the warnings mothers give their daughters about ambition and ruthlessness, in the uncomfortable understanding that power has no gender, only cost. And she's remembered now, in this telling, in this recreation of her story. Because if there's one thing Isabella Marino understood better than anyone, it's that being forgotten is the only failure that matters. She wanted to be remembered, and she was right to want it. Because her story, the story of a poor girl who became more powerful than any man around her, who rewrote the rules of organized crime, who made the FBI choose silence over justice, that story tells us something important about how the world works, about how power really operates, about the distance between what we pretend to believe and what we actually tolerate. Isabella Marino was 24 years old when she became untouchable. She was 40 when she died, and in those 16 years, she built something that no one before or since has managed. An empire of silence so complete, so comprehensive, that even now, 80 years later, we're still not entirely sure where the truth ends and the legend begins. That's the real evil. Not the murders, not the extortion, not even the corruption. The real evil is that Isabella Marino made us complicit. She made the FBI complicit by forcing them to choose between prosecuting her and maintaining their investigations. She made the families complicit by making them dependent on her expertise. She made the neighborhood complicit by providing prosperity in exchange for silence. She made everyone around her choose between confronting what she was and benefiting from what she did. And everyone chose benefit, every single time. That's why her files were burned, not because the evidence wasn't strong enough, not because the testimony wasn't credible, but because acknowledging what Isabella Marino had become would have required acknowledging what everyone around her had allowed her to become. And no one wanted to admit that. Not in 1943, not in 1960, not now. We want our monsters to be obvious. We want them to look like monsters, to sound like monsters, to announce themselves with violence and spectacle so we can point at them and say, "There, that's evil. That's what we oppose." Isabella Marino never gave us that satisfaction. She looked like a young mother. She sounded like a bookkeeper. She dressed like a widow attending mass. And while she looked like all those things, she built an empire on blood and silence and the moral flexibility of everyone around her. That's the story the FBI couldn't tell. That's the story that had to be burned. Because if that story became public, people would have to ask uncomfortable questions. How did we let this happen? Who else are we underestimating? What other evils are hiding behind appearances of respectability? Those questions have no good answers, so the story was erased, the files were burned, and Isabella Marino became a ghost, talked about in whispers, but never in ways that could be proven, never in ways that would require anyone to take action. She won, not by beating the system, but by making the system choose silence over truth. And that victory lasted long after her death, long after the families she controlled faded into history, long after the neighborhood she dominated transformed into something new. Her victory was absolute. Her evil was perfect. And the only reason we're talking about it now is because enough time has passed that telling her story feels like history rather than confession. But make no mistake, what Isabella Marino did wasn't history. It was precedent. It was blueprint. It was proof that the right person, with the right intelligence and the right willingness to abandon conscience, can build power that survives everything: investigation, prosecution, even death itself. That's what the FBI understood when they burned those files. That's what we need to understand now. Some evil isn't loud. Some evil doesn't announce itself. Some evil looks like a young woman in a church pew, rosary beads clicking between her fingers, praying to a God she stopped believing in years ago, but whose institutions she's learned to manipulate perfectly. That's Isabella Marino's legacy. Not the murders, not the money, not even the power. The legacy is the silence. The legacy is the choice everyone made to look away. The legacy is the understanding that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one's watching. She was 24 years old when she became untouchable. She was 40 when she disappeared from history. And somewhere in those 16 years, she stopped being a person and became something else. A symbol of how corruption works when it's smart enough to hide, how evil operates when it's patient enough to wait, how power consolidates when everyone with the ability to stop it chooses not to. That's the story that was too dangerous to tell in 1943. That's the story the FBI burned in 1960, and that's the story you just heard. Remember it. Not because Isabella Marino deserves to be remembered, but because the silence that protected her still protects people like her today. And silence only works when we choose not to speak.